Welcome back. Civil society organisations are now calling for more critical issues faced by children to be addressed during this Child Protection Week, including issues like the rise in the exploitation and abuse of children. Joining us now is Cheryl Pillay, an anti-drug activist. She's based in Eldos. And Lucy Jamieson is a senior researcher at the Children's Institute at the University of Cape Town. Good afternoon to you both, and thank you for your time. Cheryl Pillay, if I may start with you, you've been working with communities, particularly in Eldos, to try and stop young people from falling into drug addiction, from them being abused and extorted in that way. How difficult is it to work with vulnerable children at the moment? How difficult is it for our society to stop children falling prey to this kind of abuse? Cheryl Pillay, I don't know if you can hear me. Right. Lucy Jamieson, you've been researching this for some time, and we understand that one of the problems that we're seeing is that the amount of money which is being spent on protecting children by government is actually being cut. What kind of impact is that going to have when we try and keep children safe?
So the reality is that, children are facing increasing threats to their safety in their communities, in their homes, and the money for child protection organisations, they play a vital role in both preventing violence and in responding when children have experienced violence. And when children are left on their own devices, when families don't get the support they need, that then can lead to not just the immediate trauma, but effects on children in the longer term. So they struggle at school, some of them externalize behavior, become aggressive themselves, and turn to crime, or others, internalize the problem, and we see the kinds of problems we're having with the increased mental health burden on children, so they become depressed, anxious, and in some cases even suicidal. So the NGOs, those child protection services, providing that safety net that help children and families to prevent violence in the first place and to heal when children have been exposed.
What kind of services should we be investing in more right now? What kind of services do we need to prioritise?
The problem, Stephen, is that it's a bit of a catch-22 situation. We want to be able to, the constitutional right is to be protected from violence. So we all would agree that it is in the best interest of children to make sure that they do not experience violence in the first place. So that's a critical area for intervention. And indeed, with Child Protection Week, we've seen the Minister talking about new programs that they're investing in order to prevent violence. But the problem is that we don't also deal with children who've experienced violence. And remember, in South Africa, you're talking as a minimum national surveys that show 40% of our children experiencing violence. In some communities, in Soweto, over the course of 20 years, they looked at what was happening to one cohort. That figure was 99% of children experiencing violence. So if we don't deal with the impact of what happens when children experience violence through what we call child protection services, then that actually leads to an intergenerational cycle. So those children grow up to be more likely to be victims and perpetrators of violence. So whilst we would like to see more in preventing violence, we can't stop funding protection services, those response services, until we see the numbers of children who've experienced violence begin to shrink.
I mean, it seems like we're making a huge mistake because we're just going to perpetuate the violence. I mean, we know that if, for example, if children experience violence, the chances of them, as you use the phrase, externalizing that, the way to stop violence essentially is to produce a generation that is almost free from violence. That's very hard to do. Are we as a society about to make a big mistake here with our children, that their lives are actually getting harder, not easier?
So I think that unfortunately is the truth. And of course, we can't deal just with violence against children in isolation. We know that, children internalize and externalize when they witness violence against women. So many children who grow up in homes where there is domestic violence are also, dealing with the effects of that exposure. We know that there are many other vulnerable groups in society, but the investment in social services that is made by government is woefully inadequate to deal with a whole scale of problems. And compared to the budgets, the investment in health and education, the money that is spent on the delivery of social services is actually very small. So relatively speaking, it would cost the government very little to increase that budget quite significantly. And it would have benefits in all these other areas. Children, when they go to school, we're seeing large investments at the moment on their getting education back on track. Incredibly necessary. But if children don't get investment in protecting them from violence and helping them to deal with the trauma, they won't benefit as fully as they could do from these investments in education. The same is true in terms of healthcare, Stephen, that, children who experience violence are likely, and the research is very clear on this, their long-term health outcomes are worse than children who aren't protected. So the overall cost of violence to South African society and to our economy makes it very clear that it is worth the investment now in social services, and that's the array of social services for children and their families and other vulnerable groups will actually pay dividends in the long term.
Lucy Jamieson, thank you. Senior researcher at the Children's Institute at the University of Cape Town.